It's almost Christmas, the time of year when you can't think of what to give that special person. So today in the shed I'm going to make a couple of unique Christmas wrappers. My two granddaughters are at an age where it's very difficult to know what to buy them. So we're going to give them an event rather than stuff. But of course that's no fun to unwrap on Christmas Day. So I'm making some unique Christmas wrappers for a scroll of A4 paper that will describe what the event is. So the first step with anything to do with the lathe is to face it off. And then I want to cut a thread inside that piece of pipe. I'm going to use a 1.5mm thread, and that calls for speed A on the feed, and I have to manually change the gears. That will give me the 1.5mm thread. Having to manually change the gears is a bit of faffing around, but really I'm not doing single point thread cutting very often, and it only takes a couple of minutes to change the gears to the appropriate gearing. I have to admit that I used to find single point thread cutting quite daunting, but I've cut a number of them now to feel comfortable with the whole process. And of course, with most things, once you know how, it's not all that difficult. I prefer the single point thread cutting where you set the auto feed and then don't touch the auto feed from then on. So the feed in cuts the thread, I reverse, cut the thread again, reverse, cut the thread again, and eventually I come out with quite an acceptable little thread. I found that particularly with aluminium, if you try to cut too much at once, it tends to tear the thread, so I just take little cuts at a time and end up with a nice clean thread. So off into the lathe for the second one, and cutting the thread for that one as well. So you can see the process here that I engage the auto feed and I don't touch it from then on, and I just move forward and reverse using the forward and reverse button on the lathe, advancing the tool a little bit at a time into the work as I go. Second internal thread done. I find it easier to do the internal thread first and then fit the external thread to it. It's easier to adjust the external thread than to try to fiddle around with the internal thread, getting them to fit. With the external thread, the first thing to do is to cut it down to the outside diameter that's required. I've still got the thread cutting change gears in, and they make a lot more noise than the ordinary gears. And I have to feed by hand because the auto feeds are far too fast for just cutting. I want to cut some thread relief, and I've just made this little tool with a rounded end on it, and because I haven't got it in my tool holder, I need to put it into the holder and then set the height using my custom height gauge, which you'll see in the next video. The height gauge is a simple little tool, but very effective. I need a thread relief not only to give me a little bit of space to stop the single point cut, but also to make sure that the cap fits neatly against the tube. I'm ready to cut the external thread. Using exactly the same process as cutting the internal thread, I just move backwards and forwards, taking little bites at a time, until I finally got a thread that I think will be good enough to give a test. As it turns out, I've got it right the first time, except it doesn't screw all the way in. I just need to cut a little bit more relief there so that the tube fits right up nice and firm against what's going to be the cap. That's better. Perfect. I mucked up filming this next bit. I've put a knurl on the cap. With a nice knurl done, all I have to do is part it off. There's the first cap done, but it's still got a little tit on it from the parting off, so I'll have to do that next. So all I've done is screwed it onto the tube and put the tube in the lathe, and then I can just clean off the end there, make it nice and pretty. Right, I've got a screw cap on one end of that tube, but I need to plug the bottom end. I thought that I might weld the cap on the bottom, but thought, nah, I don't want to go to that sort of effort. So all I'm going to do is turn down a little bit more of that material so that it's just right to fit inside the tube, and then I'll part it off and simply glue it into the bottom. I went just a little bit too far. I would have liked to have a tap-in fit rather than just a push-on fit, but it'll be alright, it'll glue up okay. So I'll just part off a couple of plugs. Simple. The last step on the lathe is to polish up the tubes. So I'm just using a bit of steel wool for this. That's looking pretty good. All the bits are done. Now it's just time for final assembly, and I'm just using a bit of Loctite on those plugs to glue them into the bottom of the tubes. Now, if a job's worth doing, it's worth doing to excess, so I'm going to use some metal polish to finish it all off. The metal polish not only brings up the shine a bit more, but it stops the corrosion of the aluminium and leaves it shiny, almost forever if it's indoors. You know when this polish is doing its work because it turns from white to black as it removes little fine particles of aluminium. It's very satisfying to see that nice mirror finish coming out. The caps screw on nice and smoothly. So, the job is almost done. The paper outlines the gift activities and will be stored in this unique Christmas wrapping. The ribbons of paper are wrapped around and then sticky taped onto itself. These can easily be slid off, but it holds the whole thing in a nice cylinder so that it'll slide in and slide back out of the unique Christmas wrapping. A name tag adds the final touch, and it's ready to be put under the Christmas tree. This unique Christmas wrapping adds an extra personal touch to the present, and it was fun to build.